What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another intriguing podcast episode with me, Ramblings of a Sikh. Join us as we unravel the layers of history and explore its profound influence on the society of today. In this episode, we're joined by John Belchem, an Emeritus Professor from the University of Liverpool, author of Before the Windrush. John helps bring to light the complex racial dynamics of 20th century Liverpool, a city known for its vibrant cosmopolitanism, yet shadowed by a legacy of racial tensions. Join us as we embark on a journey through Liverpool's past, from its role in the slave trade to its transformation into a melting pot of cultures, and how these historical layers have shaped the city's identity and race relations. Get ready to be captivated by stories of resilience, the fight for equality, and the ongoing quest to redefine what it means to be a community in a world city like Liverpool. This is an episode you won't want to miss as we uncover the lessons history teaches us about the power of embracing diversity and confronting our collective past. Diving into then the book that you just mentioned, I would love to start off with what inspired you to focus on the topic at hand, like why Liverpool's race relations in the early 20th century?
Right, well, in 2007, it was the 800th anniversary of the granting of letters patent to the Borough of Liverpool, and I was invited by the City Council and the University to write a history about it. So obviously the thing that I did was to look back to see what had happened in 1907, to see what they were doing then. And of course, Ramsay Muir, who was writing the history of Liverpool then, really talked about Liverpool's cosmopolitanism. And I thought, well, that's very interesting. But when I read what he said, I could already see there was an ambivalence and an ambiguity here which sort of undercut that rather nice-sounding cosmopolitanism. If you'll just forgive me, if I could quote a couple of sentences from the book. It says, it starts off with a typical piece of Mersey pride with Liverpool and its Edwardian climacteric. There is no city in the world, not even London itself, in which so many foreign governments find it necessary to maintain consular offices for the safeguarding of their exiled subjects. Sounds wonderful, but then listen what comes next. It should, however, be noted that this amazingly polyglot and cosmopolitan population, consisting to a considerable extent of races which are backward in many ways and maintaining itself largely by unskilled labour, vastly increases the difficulty of securing and maintaining the decencies of life. So underneath that commitment to cosmopolitanism, you can begin to see an insidious form of racism just developing. And I really wanted to explore how that developed in the 20th century, because I was quite convinced that I knew stuff, having come to Liverpool just after the 81 riots, that Liverpool had what was described as a particularly horrific form of racism. And I wanted to really get to the origins of this. And to shut me up if I'm saying too much, please, but obviously, the thing about Liverpool and race relations, most people think it goes back to those absolutely horrific days of the absolutely disgusting and heinous slave trade. Yes, Liverpool really will always live under the shadow of being sort of the slaving capital of the world in the late 18th century and so on. But it seems to me, when you look at the population of Liverpool, Black Liverpool doesn't really have any demographic continuity from the days of the slave trade. The Liverpool black community, one of the oldest black communities in the UK, actually really comes about in the 19th century. And this is the type of thing that Ramsay Muir looks as though he's celebrating, because Liverpool in the 19th century wanted to get rid of the stigma of being seen to be associated with the slave trade. And it also wanted to establish itself as being somehow superior to the sort of rather monoculture of the industrial heartland. So the fact that it had an incredible cosmopolitan population of sojourners, settlers, and transients really gave it a terrific character, because Liverpool had decided after the abolition of the slave trade to develop new markets. So it attracted seamen from all sorts of places, Lascars from the Indian continent, the crew from West Africa, Chinese sailors as well. And they all came in, and they all actually rather enjoyed Liverpool. Because in the early stages of the 19th century, you weren't allowed to stay on the ships overnight because it was a fire risk. So you came off the ships and you went into Sailor Town, Liverpool, this urban strip of bars, brothels, wonderful pleasure palaces and so on. So they really got on and had a great time. And this gives Liverpool its distinctive character, some of which, of course, still hangs on today, and being the great party city that it is. But I mean, that was absolutely crucial to Liverpool. But what really interested me as I was trying to think about what happens in the early 20th century is that this all goes a little bit wrong. And they begin to get a bit too worried about things. I mean, so the Chinese seamen suddenly become a yellow peril that you've got to deal with. The Lascar things, you get worried about them because they're serving as sailors on lower terms than the white sailors. And so, you're getting white sailors determined somehow to preserve the wages of whiteness. And that means they harden their attitudes towards Lascar seamen. And also the emigration trade, because Liverpool was the great entrepreneur linking the old world and the new. The people begin to think, although they made a lot of money out of sending free migrants across the Atlantic, they suddenly think, well, there are quite a few who get stuck in Liverpool. And these they get stuck in Liverpool are described in really very unpleasant terms. And I'm quoting, this is not Belchem, this is the reference, referring to them as being the scum left by the tide of migration across the Atlantic. So you put all those things together, and so you suddenly find Liverpool, having preened itself as this cosmopolitan place, suddenly wants to deport the Chinese. It supports the Alien Acts, which come in 1905 and so on, and really develops a nasty form of racism, which goes on and on. And what interested me is the fact that, well, look, this is all decades before the Windrush. Why didn't we learn anything from what was going on in Liverpool? Because here, as Liverpool moves beyond its great Edwardian years, as we move beyond the 1907 things, and we go into considerable economic depression and so on, and Liverpool begins to slip down the urban hierarchy, you would have thought that really there were lessons in what was going to go wrong when the United Kingdom suddenly realized that it was moving towards decolonization, becoming post-industrial, becoming post-colonial, and having all sorts of difficulties with racialized relations. They were seen first in Liverpool, but nobody really took account of it.
There's so many questions off the back of what you've mentioned that we could dive into. One that I just would love to pick your brain about is then what were some of the, as in you've touched upon kind of slavery, you've touched upon the empire, colonialism, you touched upon about how Liverpool is a major port city, and obviously that influences its kind of racial dynamics and community relations. But what are some of the historical events? What are some of the kind of the turning points that affect Liverpool's race relations prior to Windrush?
Yeah, well, I think really the thing to concentrate on is around the two world wars, actually, because Liverpool, as we were saying, was used to this wonderful collection of cosmopolitan sailors and so on, many of whom marry with local girls and so on. But you get a problem during both world wars that the United Kingdom, as this great sort of imperial power, relies upon people from its colonies and so on to help it out in the struggle. And the unfortunate thing about the people that come along, I say the unfortunate thing, this is the way they were perceived at the time, that they weren't exactly the right skin colour. So you had the problem of what was called at the time coloured colonials. And, you're very glad for the support that they give you during the war and so on. And to do take steps to try to make sure they have hospitality during the war and so on. But come the end of the war, my God, you want to get rid of them. You don't want to, you don't want the fact that you've treated them so well during the war to become an incentive to encourage more of these people with the wrong phenotypic characteristics to come in. And so you get substantial race riots straight after the First World War, because Liverpool as a port really suffers in the move from war to peace. Trade suffers more than manufacture and things like that during the interwar years. And it really hits Liverpool hard. And so there are people thinking, they're coming back from the trenches themselves, they're coming back for their home fit for heroes, only to find these, I'll put this in inverted commas, these black guys pinching their work and pinching their women. This is really undercutting white working class masculinity. And so you get some horrific race riots in 1919, leading to the death of Charles Walton, who is chased by a baying crowd and jumps into Queen's Dock to try to save himself, but alas drowns. You get similar things happening after the Second World War. You get race riots in 1948, and even worse after the Second World War, is the poor Chinese citizens, many of whom are, married, had children and so on, were actually forcibly deported. I mean, they tried, when people were clearly colonials, they did have a claim on British citizenship. These people, they tried to offer little incentives for them to return to the colonies. But those considered aliens, like the Chinese, were just forcibly taken away. And there are many people today, still in the Liverpool Chinese community, who just think their fathers had deserted them, but they don't. But it's a terribly, terribly sad story. So there are some really ghastly moments in all of this.
One thing that jumps out to me is how a lot of this language isn't dissimilar to, say, some of the language used by politicians in the modern day. You've had Suella Braverman, like a few months ago before she was sacked, basically doing a kind of a repeat of Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood. My question is that continuous use of these ridiculously racist excuses, and equally are these excuses or these reasonings that these people put forward the same simply because it's coming from that same area of threat, which is a threat to white masculinity viewed in a particular perspective, and it's that which is being put forward as this is what's under threat? Or is that taking it a step too far?
No, I think that there is a continuity, but there are times, of course, when it's more accentuated than others, and the really, a disturbing feature that I find, particularly when I look at interwar Liverpool, is the fact you've got people who are paternalists, you've got people who have got missionary zeal, and you've got people who are getting this new form of social science, and you think, that's going to lead to a better understanding. But unfortunately it doesn't, because Liverpool really goes mad for eugenics, a sort of pseudo-scientific, biological racism, which is absolutely awful. And you get these people who form the Liverpool Association for the Welfare of Half-Caste Children, without realising that very language is the last thing that's going to do to promote the welfare of these children. And you get tremendous articulation of hostility towards those who indulge in miscegenation. They see this is absolutely awful. So, I mean, I can point to prior periods in Liverpool's history where Braverman would actually seem to be on the more moderate side. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I mean, yeah. I mean, there weren't
to put it into perspective.
It is staggering. From people who purportedly say, we're concerned about them, but they actually talk about these. A half-caste child is seen as having a physical deformity, is the way it's described in the 1930s. Absolutely horrendous.
Just then, kind of going back to the individuals, so the coloured colonials, for want of a better word at the moment. Could you possibly share some of their stories and what they experienced, and also kind of how that matches, or not necessarily matches, more contrasts with their expectations?
Again, there is this notion that when they come to Liverpool, they're coming to the metropole, they're coming to the heart of the motherland, as they would see it, and are expecting it all to be wonderfully British in a way that they understand what Britishness is. I mean, take, for example, a very important guy in Liverpool, Pastor Daniels Eckhart. Now, he comes from Calabar. It comes during the First World War. We've just been saying how the number of people increased during that time. And he comes with the notion that he wants to become a holy man in what he thinks is the holy motherland. So when he arrives, he sees somebody walking along with a dog collar in Lime Street. So he thinks he'll introduce himself to them and get him to help. And is told by this person, and please forgive me the very heavy the inverted commas here, but this person refuses to speak to someone who he considers a... and this really, really worries Eckhart. And I mean, the poor chap, you can understand it, I think. goes off the rails a little bit, gets into gambling and so on. But after a few years, finds his faith again, and then is decided, and this is, all credit to him, because I think he plays this the right way round. He then decides that he's going to stick to this notion of what Britain and Britishness should be, and he demands British justice for his fellow people coming from West Africa, coming on the ships and so on, that they should be treated equally, they should get equal pay, they should not suffer the discrimination, they should not suffer police harassment and so on. They're not, it's interesting, he says that, they are not aliens, they are British, and they've come here because they believe in things like British justice. So even those who suffer indignities when they get to what they thought was the promised motherland still cling to still try to use Britishness against those racist attitudes. And I think it's Descartes does very, very well. He sets up the African Church's mission. He does a tremendous amount of good work for people and so on, to the point at which the authorities get so worried they get MI5 to do a security check on this guy. But there's another interesting thing here, which I wish I understood this thing better than I do, that in the African Church's mission, though he's doing everything he can to help people who are in dire financial circumstances, who are suffering discrimination, disadvantage, and so on, he's also really concentrating on the children of these relationships and trying to provide them with an education so that they could return to the colonies and lead those colonies towards economic development. And that's interesting. I'm never quite sure what this is about. That, if you come to Britain, you try to play Britishness and so on, but then actually you're trying to take bits of it away and create your own identity back out in where you came from.
One thing that struck me when you were talking about how they were playing ideas of Britishness is that for them it's more of, it seems to be that for them it's more of an idea of what Britain is supposed to be, whereas the racists back home, Britishness is whiteness, and that seems to be kind of the theme, so to speak, so far. But then obviously it gets complicated when you have people like Suella Braverman talking on the same page, because you're kind of like, well, as the descendant of immigrants, how does this necessarily add up? Which is a paradox for me. So perhaps we don't necessarily have to dive into that, but one thing that I wanted to ask you was, you mentioned how he appealed to the idea of British justice. So, how did legal frameworks at the time kind of contribute to the racial discrimination in Liverpool, or was the system itself racist in its outcomes in the same way as perhaps there's a general understanding of how, say, American justice worked within the Jim Crow era, which was, you're black, you're going to prison, quite simply. Whereas, what was it perhaps like in Liverpool during the period that you studied?
Yes, well, the authorities are really struggling with this. There are all sorts of people who are playing upon the inconsistencies, ambiguities, and so on of racism. You've got, shipping employers who are trying to get cheap labour. You've got white trade union leaders trying to preserve the things of whiteness. You've got Home Office and other officials worried about the fact of public order if there is too much immigration going on. And you've got all of those things going on. But within all of this, there is still that overriding notion of the fact that we are British. We have the great British Empire, the greatest empire there's ever been, and so on. And within that, there are notions that if you're in the British Empire, you are British. So that gives real problems. And an indication, this is what I was saying earlier, that why haven't people taken enough notice of Liverpool? If they'd have realised that there's nothing new about a hostile environment, nothing new about a Suella Braverman. Let me quote from an early 1930s Home Office document where they're dealing with the problems of more and more sailors coming to Liverpool, marrying local women, settling down there, having a good time. And they said this, that, I quote, "It is a penalty of being a mother country with a large mixed empire. The most that we can do is to discourage coloured seamen from obtaining British passports so that we can treat them as aliens when they get here and prevent them remaining." So, they whenever they can, if they can pinch passports off people, if they can make the documentation harder still to get onto the shipping register and so on, anything like that they can do, because they realise they've got a huge, huge problem here. They don't want to be seen as giving up those crucial British values, but they don't want too many of these people with the wrong colour skin here.
Sounds like a page out of Nigel Farage's playbook, really. But just coming back to what you were mentioning, I think the thing that I'd be interested in finding out is, how did the legal status of the individual work? So when the person, say from Africa or the Lascar from India, gets off that ship and steps foot in Liverpool, what is their legal status, and how do they as in, is there a route to legality, so to speak? Like, as in, how does it work? And how is that system played?
I mean, provided they can show that they come from a part of the British Empire and so on, they are British and they have an absolute right to stay here. I mean, some of them reinforce the point that, well, I'm a bit worried about it because they know there are all these things to sort of question your paperwork or remove it from you and do things. So they take the additional security of marrying. That's one way of doing it. This is, it's not necessarily, it's not equivalent to a green card thing, and it's just a sort of an extra insurance policy, and I don't blame them. And they are very well. I mean, this is the other strange thing. I mean, I've been saying how Liverpool has a much wider cosmopolitan population than other places, but if we move the clock on into the second half of the 20th century, things change. Liverpool has become a bit of a basket case, as it were. It's fallen further and further down the urban hierarchy. The economic things are not attractive. It's not necessarily a place that an economic migrant would think about coming to. So why is it that we still have a problem of race relations? Because Liverpool has an extremely high number of mixed marriages, extremely high number of things like that, and an extremely low number of new migration. And at the time of the Windrush, I mean, people have been coming into Liverpool after the Second World War thinking that they're still going to get wartime wages, which they don't. But it becomes abundantly clear soon after this that Liverpool is not where you want to be. And because Liverpool is a port, not a textile centre and so on, people from the new Commonwealth, textile workers from the Indian subcontinent and so on, they're not going to come to a place like Liverpool. So Liverpool has incredibly low numbers of new migration at this particular time. Very, very high numbers of mixed marriages and so on. And yet still has race riots, still has problems. It's had pioneer attempts at race relations and so on. And yet it still can't sort itself out. And it can't sort itself out because, we've moved on from the problem of being British to the problem of wanting to be, fair. So you have charities who are saying, we can't set up a separate thing just for the Liverpool blacks because that would be discriminating. That would be sort of segregating them, putting them on a thing. It's a little bit like the argument that used to be the Labour Party about a women's section. You don't want to do that. And the same thing with the City Council. The City Council said, no, we're not going to make special provision for anyone with that. We treat every citizen of Liverpool in the self-same way. We can't possibly discriminate in that way. So you get the real problems then of, by this time, you've got second, third, fourth generation Liverpool-born blacks, as it were, who, what they're asking for is to be realised that they do need some special treatment to deal with decades and decades of discrimination, disadvantage, harassment, and so on. But one of the famous reports on it says they're special but not separate, and it can't get the voluntary agencies, it can't get the City Council to realise that that's the position that they're in. And as such, the City Council is starting doing silly things, really. It's following what's going on in those parts of the country which are attracting new immigrants post-Windrush and so on. So it's putting on English language classes and so on. Well, this is an offence to these people who have been, Liverpool citizens for decades, for God's sake. So it just can't get it right. And matters get it well. I was going to jump ahead to the 81 riots and so on. The unfortunate thing about the 81 riots is what comes after is militant. When militant take over the Liverpool City Council, they have a really strong workerist ideology. They are certainly not going to make any special provision for any division within it. It's either the whole working class or it's nothing. So they're really hostile to any people who are trying to do things to adjust those decades of discrimination against the black population.
Just for those listening, do you mind giving kind of an overview of some of the race riots and racial incidents that take place kind of in Liverpool over the 20th century or so? Because obviously we've kind of jumped from 1907 to 1981, and that's obviously like a large expanse. And those listening are probably like, well, it sounds like there was a lot going on. So please.
Yeah. Well, better still if I got the book and read it. So we have the 1919 riots. We have all the terrible problems during the 1930s with that eugenic stuff and an absolutely disgusting report by the Association for the Welfare of Half-Caste Children and so on. We then have, again, as we get to the problems of economic dislocation in 1948, we have more race riots. And then in 1972, now the 72 is interesting because this is when you're beginning to realize the fact that the problem is going to be youth. I mean, there were some people who are now looking to Liverpool thinking that, oh, well, look, Liverpool actually didn't have race riots in 1958. The race riots in Notting Hill and so on, which really worry people, thinking, oh my God, this is the first real sort of worrying signal after the arrival of the Windrush. And people are thinking, well, over time this will disappear and so on. But Liverpool gives them a classic example in 72 that it isn't going to go away. That as these disadvantaged, discriminate against Liverpool youth approach adolescence and so on, and racial polarisation, they become really a lot more militant in their black identity than others. And that really does become quite a challenge. And that, of course, made so much worse by the fact that at the same time as that, the police are becoming more and more aggressive in their attitudes towards black youth in Liverpool. So there's almost a continuous history. I mean, there's a brief period, as I say, around the first race riots which happen outside of Liverpool, when people come to Liverpool and say, how did you manage it? How did you get away without that? Thinking that Liverpool really has lessons to learn. But then as time goes on, and the Liverpool black youth get more and more disenchanted and more annoyed at the behaviour of the police and the authorities, then you get them build up to what is going to become the riots in 1981. But the 1981 riots, well, I've got to be careful. I mean, many people actually don't like to call them riots. They actually refer to them as an uprising. Because whereas everything we've had up until this point in 1919, 1948, 1972 have been clearly black against white in the rioting, in 1981, the whites are right there with the blacks against the police, against the authorities, and because this is a real protest against marginalisation and so on. Now, admittedly, it all starts off by police harassment, which clearly has a racist motive to it. But once it gets started, it is really very, very different. And some people say, this is an uprising of Liverpool 8, one of the most deprived parts of the city, against marginalisation, against the way it's losing out on so many things. But unfortunately, look at the response to it. Everybody thinks, isn't Heseltine, what he does for Minister of Merseyside. But I mean, his initiatives and so on really don't have a specific commitment to fighting racial discrimination. It's all about urban deprivation. And the measures that he does, I mean, all very nice. It makes the place look a little bit better and so on. But how are they paid for? They're paid for out of central services, which most of the Liverpool-born blacks were requiring. So actually, the cost of sort of trying to deal with the riot, and the fact, yes, we've woken up, we're doing things, actually make things worse. In the sense there's less money there for the essential welfare services because all the money is going into these gentrification and cosmetic things to make Liverpool look a little bit better.
Why do you think there's been a lack over time of wanting to address the issue? Is it just as simple as saying it's ideological or it's racist or it's X or Y? Like, what are the main reasons for kind of there being generations of marginalization and deprivation, specifically in this case towards blacks?
Yeah, well, I think it's probably because some people are thinking, well, it won't happen here. I mean, this is why they make Liverpool somewhere different. You were talking about it as a great port city. I mean, it is. I mean, it's described in the 19th century as the New York of Europe, a world city rather than merely British provincial. And Liverpool is different in that way. In some senses, from the 19th century historian, Liverpool is different because it's greater. When you come into the 20th century, of course, Liverpool is different because it is seen as a sort of a shock city of post-industrial, post-colonial Britain. So I think most people in sort of mainstream Middle England think, well, this is the sort of thing which happens to Liverpool, but it won't get to us. And so I think that's why there is that sort of a fit of absence of mind which goes on.
Would it be fair to say that's the same kind of attitude that was shown towards Liverpool with, for argument's sake, the Hillsborough tragedy? Because it's kind of almost as like it's. I know there's a whole case of police cover-up and police brutality and all of that, but it's almost like, it's in the north, and there's always that conversation within Britain of the north-south divide and how the south is always continuously invested in and the north is just left behind.
Well, that Liverpool has come to be seen as the internal other. It is the proverbial exception. Everybody, I suppose, sort of most nation states need to have somewhere that they can denigrate, they can traduce, and so on. And Liverpool has been the kicking stall of Britain for a long, long time. So it's gone from being the great second city of empire, a second only to London, to now being seen as the one thing which is really holding back enterprise Britain. So there's been so much marginalisation of Liverpool, which has been really, really sad. The only thing I will say about it is that Liverpool, or just as we were saying very early on, had to rebrand itself after the horrors of the slave trade and so on. So Liverpool now has to rebrand itself from being that terrible shock city and so on. And it's been really largely quite successful because although it's still not a tremendous economic hub, it has got some biomedical things and so on here, but it's not really at the forefront of any sort of economic breakthrough. But what it has discovered is how useful culture and a visitor economy are being. By having previously been described as the other, people will now say, well, if you want a staycation, why not go to Liverpool? Because Liverpool is different. And Liverpool has got much to offer, and having much to offer, I think that's got rid of some of the racial problems. Because if you want to come to a place which has got wonderful diverse culture, if you want to come to a place which is lively and so on, then it's got to be as cosmopolitan as it possibly can be. So I think that the way Liverpool has regenerated itself with this emphasis on culture may help to heal some of the wounds of the horrific racism that it had throughout the 20th century.
Just kind of going back into your book and then a little bit further back into the 20th century, it's a phrase that actually came up again in the news recently because of the far-right protests that occurred on Armistice Day against the straw man of them saying that, like, how dare the pro-Palestinian march take place. And that phrase was, there ain't no black in the Union Jack. For those listening, could you kind of explain the significance of that phrase in the context of your book and kind of what it means and kind of its context and its use?
Yeah, well, it's a wonderful phrase that Paul Gilroy used, isn't it? And I think it's exactly the experience that these people coming from the colonies, coming to what they think is the motherland, coming to the real epicenter of being British, and are so proud and determined, as it were, to display and pronounce their Britishness, only to find that they're really not wanted. And this happens, they see this time and time again. I mean, if there's labour shortage, there are some labour shortage after the Second World War, for example, it's much better to bring in Eastern Europeans than to bring in more of those coloured colonials and so on, so that coloured colonials increasingly find that the British Empire is really about the white dominions. Nobody gives a damn about coloured colonies, as it were. And so this is the big irony that Stuart Hall picked up on, that just as Britain is finally deciding that it needs to decolonise itself, Having thought that, well, the colours and things like that, they're out there and the whites are here. Suddenly they start coming in using their British rights. They really get caught out on that. So there ain't no black in the Union Jack is a wonderfully telling phrase. But, well, I'd love to think that we're moving to things where that no longer applies, but I'm afraid, alas, it still does.
You pointed out that the riot/uprising 1981 were kind of a different kind of event in relation to what had occurred prior. How did that change the perception of race relations in Liverpool, considering, if, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, there hasn't been a race riot since? So how did that kind of change the dynamics or the context of what was happening?
It takes quite a long time for it to change things, because we get various like the Liverpool Aid Defence Committee and so on, trying after the riots to say that the problem was not there is the problem of urban deprivation, but what really has to be addressed first and foremost is the institutional racism, particularly as articulated by the Chief Constable of the Merseyside Police at the time. But they can't get anywhere with that, and the City Council again just concentrate on economic deprivation, refuse to break this down to say there might be specific. I was going to use the term ethnic, but can you really call Liverpool-born blacks ethnic? I'm not sure on that one. They don't fit into the multiculturalism thing because they've got no obvious sort of ethnic boundary that they could set up. That's another problem. The multiculturalism doesn't help them at all. We've already talked about the Heseltine initiatives, again, not really addressing that crucial issue of race. There is deprivation, but the deprivation is enhanced for those who suffer from racial discrimination, and it's made worse, as I've already said, by militant. And it's finally when we kick militant out that we get the Gifford inquiry, Lord Gifford Desert inquiry, in the late 80s into it, and that's when we get this phrase that's describing Liverpool as having horrific racism. And I think it's from that time on that people begin to say, well, we've really got to try to do something about that. And you put that alongside the fact that it coincides with the worsening of economic situations when, the whole managed decline stuff that Thatcher and Geoffrey Howe are trying to do to Liverpool, when we can begin to reverse that and we move into what I was saying is cultural regeneration. That culture, unlike previous definitions of Britishness or whatever it is, culture is genuinely universal, and that is what has helped, I think, improve things. But that's taken a long time after the 81 riots. So the 81 riots in themselves are not the turning point.
What was perhaps some of the more surprising findings during your research in relation to Liverpool's race relations?
Well, I think some of the staggering and appalling things that they did. I know we've been talking a lot about the distinction between being British and being alien, but the behaviour towards the aliens is pretty awful. I think the single worst thing is the deportation of those Chinese sailors who had done so much to help the war effort and so on in the Second World War and so on, and just literally pulled off the streets without any chance to say goodbye to their wives, their children, and so on, and just lost forever. It's unbelievably horrific, that, I think. And that, to me, is the single worst thing. There are troubling things which we've not mentioned in all of this, and that's the fact that, I've been using the term, most people do, but black as if it was homogenous, but precisely because you do have such a cosmopolitan thing in Liverpool, you have people who look at this and try to say, well, look, you've got two people from different parts of Africa. They're as different as if you're in Europe as the English and the Italians, and yet you're putting them together. And there are real tensions, particularly during the Second World War, when we bring in a number of West Indian technicians to help out with munitions and things of this nature. Now, these West Indians, and again, I'm using the terms used at the time, are considered to be very touchy and sensitive about race, whereas the West African seamen in Liverpool, they just put up with things, they see. And there's a real effort to make sure that these West Indians are protected from what was called contamination by the West African sailors in Liverpool. I mean, it's incredible the way that it's done. We're very conscious of the fact, we don't want to offend West Indians and so on, because there's already been some riots there in the late 1930s before these people come over. So we really want to make sure that we don't ruffle things too much there. But credit, and I'm very reluctant to do this, but credit to the Colonial Office Welfare Department. They seem to realise that as well as separating the new coming West Indians from the long-established West Africans, that they need also to take account of the fact that we do have a resident black population. We're not just people here for the war. These are people that have been here for decades and so on. And so the Colonial Office is beginning to say, we need to do something for them. And so they begin to think not just in terms of wartime hospitality provision for the West Indians, but they need to do something for the resident population. And that's why they move towards things like community projects, setting up a colonial welfare committee run by the Personal Service Society and so on. So, Liverpool does start to try to do things there, but the tensions between the West Africans and the West Indians makes sometimes rather difficult reading. For those, given what I've been saying about this essential thing being the phenotypical difference between white and black, there are gradations, of course, with a bit of all of that, and it's made far, far worse by the fact that some West Indians who settle here decide that they will call the Liverpool blacks browns, and that becomes almost as offensive as talking earlier about half-caste or subsequently mixed race. It's very, very difficult to find the right term. People tried, some sociologists who were the early stages of the race relations as an academic discipline, tried to introduce the term African English of them, but it didn't stick. Strange, because there is a hyphenated identity in Liverpool. That's the Liverpool Irish. So, but no, it couldn't get African English.
What are some of the lasting impacts then of the early 20th century and the race relations in Liverpool on the city's current cultural and social landscape? You obviously earlier spoke about how Liverpool's changed so much and had to come to grips with its past and kind of reinvent itself. But yeah, what are kind of some of the lasting impacts of what you've studied?
Sorry, this sounds terribly vain. So I wish there'd been more of a lasting impact from my book on Before the Windrush, on my attempt to say, well, look, if you want to come to grips with racism in Liverpool, you've not only got to look at slavery, and please, I don't diminish the significance of that at all, but I don't think it really gets to the heart of the problem. And I mean, Liverpool is doing wonderful things now. I mean, there's a fantastic project at National Museums Liverpool, this waterfront project, which is going to put the International Slavery Museum right in the Martin Luther King building, which is right at the front of what was the old traffic office, right at the front of the Albert Dock and so on. It's going to be marvellous, and it would be a wonderful, much-needed resource. But again, you see, it is this, well, I was going to say preoccupation. I mean, it's always slavery-led, and it's quite right. I mean, we cannot apologise enough about the slave trade. But please, if we're really going to understand racism, can we look beyond what was going on at that particular period and see what happened from the late 19th through the 20th century? That's really at the core of what made that horrific racism.
I just want to say thank you. I've gone through all of the questions that I had prepared, and we've kind of explored, I think, quite a lot in the 45 minutes or so. I just want to double check. Is there anything that you wish to mention, or anything that you think we haven't included that you just would like to?
Well, no, the only thing I should say is I should apologise in the sense that I feel a little bit past my sell-by date. Before the Windrush was the last book I wrote before I retired. I've been retired for 10 or 11 years now. So my memory, I'm afraid, is, as one gets into advanced age, is getting a little bit amnesiac. So I'm not as on the ball as I really should be. So I probably have not answered the questions as well as I might have been able to do 10 years ago.
Alright, so that's the end of another podcast episode. I hope you guys enjoyed this as much as I enjoyed putting it together. If you want to support the work that I'm doing, then consider becoming a Patreon member or a YouTube member via the links in the description below. Otherwise than that, I just want to say thank you for making it this far to the end. And a quick shout out to our Patreon members: Sean Singh, Rajvinder Kaur, Gurpreet Danjal, Gagan Singh, Yasmin Jazwa, Ramneek Gaur, Rav Singh, Ramneek Gaur, Anish Man, Gurdeep Bath, Gurpreet Singh, and Jazz Dillon. Also, a quick shout out to our YouTube members: Rav Singh, V, Jazz Dillon, Ravi Singh, Simi Sandhu, A Little History of the Sikhs, Wushu Man, Dadaji Kaur, G Singh, Gary Parmar, and N Singh. Otherwise than that, thank you for tuning in. Hopefully I'll see you in the next podcast episode. Bye.